"It is a forgery." The words left his lips not with the thunder of a duke's proclamation, but as a hollow, rasping sound, the noise of a man watching his own skeleton being unearthed. Duke Alistair Beaumont stared at the charcoal sketch, a likeness of his wife, Genevieve, rendered with an intimacy that felt like a physical violation. He had returned to his London home, the air thick with the scent of whiskey and his cousin's insinuations, to find this scene, a disheveled artist standing in Genevieve's private sitting room, the damning portrait in his hand, and Genevieve herself, frozen by the doorway, her face a mask of white, shocked porcelain. In that moment, a carefully constructed dam of ignorance and apathy within him shattered, unleashing a flood of cold, misplaced fury. He condemned her with a look, with a single, clipped dismissal that severed their life together as cleanly as a guillotine. Now, 3 years later, in a grimy solicitor's office smelling of dust and regret, Alistair finally understood. He had not been the judge, he had been the weapon. The true betrayal was not a fleeting infidelity, but a slow, meticulously planned assassination of a woman's character, and he had been its willing executioner. Somewhere in the bleak, windswept north of England, a woman he had cast out was living with the consequences of his blindness, a woman who carried a secret he was only just beginning to comprehend. And as he stared at the proof of his cousin's treachery, a single, horrifying question clawed at his soul. What else had he destroyed in his haste to believe a lie? The Beaumont ducal residence was less a home and more a museum of joyless grandeur. Sunlight struggled through tall, grime-streaked windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the heavy air. The silence was an entity in itself, broken only by the funereal ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall and the rustle of servants' uniforms as they ghosted through the corridors. For Genevieve, Duchess of Beaumont, the silence was a constant companion, a weight that pressed down on her chest. She felt like another of the Duke's acquisitions, beautiful, well-bred, and utterly inanimate. Her husband, Alistair, was a man carved from granite and duty. He moved through his life with an aristocratic detachment that she had once mistaken for strength. Now she knew it for what it was, a profound, unbreachable emptiness. Their conversations were exchanges of social obligation, their dinners elaborate pantomimes of intimacy. He would look at her, his startlingly blue eyes sweeping over her fine silk gown and the pearls at her throat, but she felt he never truly saw her. He saw the Duchess, the mother of his future heir, a role she had yet to fulfill, a failure that hung in the oppressive air between them. The atmosphere was thick with the cloying scent of lilies, funereal flowers that seemed to bloom in every cavernous room, their perfume a constant reminder of decay. Genevieve often found herself standing by the windows, gazing down at the relentless parade of London society, feeling as trapped as a songbird in a gilded cage. The world outside was a swirling vortex of rules and expectations, of veiled insults and razor-sharp smiles, and the world inside was a silent, suffocating tomb. Her only point of human contact, however skewed, was Alistair's cousin, Lord Percival Thorne. He was a man of effortless charm and shadowed eyes, a constant presence at their dinner table in Alistair's study, his voice a smooth, silken thread, weaving itself into the fabric of their lives. He treated Genevieve with a cloying solicitousness that made her skin crawl. "My dear cousin," Percival would murmur, his gaze lingering on her pale face, "you look unwell. The city air does not agree with your delicate constitution. Alistair, you must take her to the country." Alistair would grunt in agreement, his attention fixed on a shipping ledger or a political dispatch. Perhaps in the autumn. But Percival's concern was a poison administered in careful doses. He would plant seeds of doubt in Alistair's mind, always under the guise of familial care. He spoke of Genevieve's quiet moods, her long hours spent alone, hinting at a melancholy that might lead a woman to seek distractions. Genevieve was indeed unwell, but not in the way Percival suggested. For weeks, a nauseating wave had greeted her each morning, a dizzying fatigue settling into her bones by midday. She was with child. The realization had brought a fleeting, terrifying surge of joy, followed by a profound sense of dread. How could she tell Alistair? How could she introduce the hope of a child into this mausoleum of a marriage? She feared his reaction would be one of polite satisfaction, another duty fulfilled, another box ticked on the ducal checklist. So she hid her secret, wearing looser gowns, pleading headaches, her hand resting protectively on her still flat abdomen when no one was looking. The growing life within her was the only warmth in her cold world, a secret sun she nurtured in the darkness. The unease was a constant hum beneath the surface of her days. She felt watched, not just by the servants whose loyalty was to the house and its master, but by Percival. His eyes seemed to miss nothing, his smile never quite reaching them. He was a spider, and she was beginning to feel the first, faint vibrations of his web. The foreshadowing of the end was not in a thunderclap, but in the slow, creeping chill that settled over the house, a chill that had nothing to do with the English weather, and everything to do with the man who called her husband cousin. The end came on a Tuesday. The air was heavy and damp, threatening a storm that refused to break. Alistair was at his club, a nightly ritual that left Genevieve to dine alone in the cavernous dining hall, the array of polished silver and crystal mocking her solitude. She had retired early to her private sitting room, a small sanctuary of chintz and watercolor paintings that felt like the only space in the house that was truly hers. She was sketching, a pastime her mother had deemed a suitable, gentle art for a lady, when a soft knock came at the door. Thinking it was her maid, she called, "Enter." The man who stepped inside was not a servant. He was a stranger, young and poorly dressed, with ink stains on his fingers and a look of desperate panic in his eyes. He was Mr. Davies, an artist she had briefly spoken to at a society exhibition weeks ago, a man whose talent was raw but undeniable. He clutched a charcoal sketch in his hand. "Your Grace," he stammered, his face ashen. "Forgive this intrusion. I was told you wished to see my latest work." Confusion warred with alarm. She had made no such request. "I think you are mistaken," she began, rising from her seat. "Who told you this?" Before he could answer, the door was thrown open again, this time with a force that made the porcelain on the mantelpiece rattle. Alistair stood there, his large frame filling the doorway. His face, usually a mask of controlled indifference, was dark with a rage she had never seen. Behind him, a step into the shadows, was Percival, his expression a perfect blend of shock and sorrow. The tableau was set. The distraught wife, the flustered, disheveled young man, and the proof, the charcoal sketch of her own face, held in the artist's trembling hand. Alistair's gaze moved from the artist to Genevieve, then to the sketch. It was a cold, methodical inventory of her guilt. The whiskey on his breath reached her from across the room, mingling with the scent of rain and betrayal. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice was lethally quiet. "Alistair, I can explain," she pleaded, her heart hammering against her ribs. "This man is mistaken. I do not know why he is here." "He is here because you summoned him," Percival said, his voice laced with manufactured grief. "Alistair, I tried to warn you. Her melancholy, her long afternoons away from home." It was a masterpiece of manipulation. Alistair, his judgment clouded by alcohol, and the seeds of suspicion Percival had so carefully planted for months, saw only what he was meant to see. He saw a deceitful wife and a clandestine meeting. He did not see the terrified artist who had clearly been coerced, nor the desperation in his wife's eyes. He took a step into the room, his blue eyes chips of ice. He did not shout. He did not raise a hand. His violence was of a colder, more devastating variety. "Get out," he said to the artist, who scrambled from the room like a frightened rabbit. Then he turned his frozen gaze on Genevieve. The world seemed to tilt and fall away. The ticking of the clock in the hall sounded like hammer blows against an anvil. The air grew thin, impossible to breathe. She saw her entire life, her future, the future of the child she carried, dissolving in the glacial fury of his eyes. There was no trial, no jury, only a swift and brutal execution. "I will have my solicitor draw up the papers in the morning," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "This marriage is over." He turned and walked away, leaving her in the ruins of her life. The cold shock was so profound it was almost peaceful. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane, a place of utter annihilation where sound and feeling ceased to exist. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply stood there, a ghost in her own home, her hand instinctively moving to cover the secret she now had to protect at all costs. The storm had finally broken, and it had washed her entire world away. The morning brought a gray, unforgiving light. Genevieve had not slept. She had sat in the same chair all night, the charcoal sketch lying on the floor where the artist had dropped it, its intimate lines a cruel mockery. She felt hollowed out, a fragile shell of the woman she had been. A sharp knock preceded the entry of a dour-faced man in a dark suit, Alistair's solicitor, Mr. Blackwood. He moved with a funereal solemnity, placing a sheaf of documents on the mahogany table. Behind him, like a vulture circling a fresh kill, was Percival. "Your Grace," Blackwood said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "His Grace, the Duke, has instructed me to present you with these." They were annulment papers. The words swam before her eyes, a blur of legal jargon that amounted to one simple, brutal fact. Her existence in this world was being erased. "Alistair has already signed," Percival informed her, a note of triumph barely concealed beneath his somber facade. He gestured to the bold, angry signature at the bottom of the first page. "He wishes this to be concluded with expediency and discretion." Discretion. The word was acid. They were not annulling a marriage. They were covering up a scandal, and she was the stain to be removed. She picked up the pen, her hand surprisingly steady. There was no fight left in her, only a desperate, primal need for escape. She wanted to be away from this house, away from these men, away from the life that had suffocated her. She signed her name, Genevieve Beaumont, for the last time. As she did, she noted there was a second page attached, a dense block of text concerning settlements and provisions. She did not read it. What did it matter? No amount of money could undo this. It was blood money, payment for her silence and her disappearance. She pushed the papers across the table. "Is that all?" she asked, her voice a stranger's. Blackwood, flustered for a moment, glanced at the second page. "Your Grace, you should—" "Is that all?" she repeated, her gaze unwavering. Percival stepped forward. "Yes, my dear, that is all. A carriage will be arranged to take you to your family's country estate." No, she would not run to her family, to face their shame and their pity. She would not be their burden. She would simply disappear. While they busied themselves with the documents, she walked out of the room. She moved through the grand house like a phantom, unseen and unheard. In her bedchamber, she did not look at the lavish gowns in the wardrobe or the jewel case on her vanity. They were the trappings of a life that was no longer hers. They belonged to the Duchess of Beaumont, and that woman was dead. Instead, she pulled a small, worn valise from the back of the wardrobe. Into it, she packed two simple, dark-colored day dresses, her sturdiest pair of walking boots, and a thick woolen shawl. She took no jewelry, save for the plain gold band on her finger, which she twisted off and placed deliberately on the pillow of the cold, empty bed she had once shared with her husband. Her final act of severance. From a locked hat box, she retrieved a small leather pouch. It contained the savings from her personal allowance, a meager sum she had squirreled away over the years. It was not much, but it would be enough to start again, somewhere far from here. Her hand rested on her lower belly, a gesture that had become second nature. This was no longer just about her own survival. It was about the survival of her child. This tiny, unborn being was innocent of all this, a spark of life that deserved more than a world of scandal and rejection. She would protect this child from the Beaumont name, from the cold legacy of a father who had cast them out without a second thought. She walked down the grand staircase, her light footsteps making no sound on the thick runner. She passed servants who averted their eyes, their faces carefully blank. She did not use the main entrance. She slipped out through a side door, the one used by gardeners and tradesmen, and stepped out into the damp London morning. The city air, once a symbol of her confinement, now tasted of freedom. She pulled her shawl tight, lowered her head, and melted into the anonymous morning crowd, shedding her identity, her title, and her past with every step she took. She was no longer a duchess. She was just Genevieve, and she was on her own. The journey north was a blur of rattling carriage wheels and rain-streaked landscapes. Genevieve traveled for days, pushing ever onward, seeking not a destination, but an obliteration of her starting point. She bought passage on mail coaches, sharing benches with farmers and merchants, her simple clothes and quiet demeanor rendering her invisible. She spoke little, ate less, and slept in fits, her dreams haunted by the cold fury in Alistair's eyes. Each mile put between her and London was a stitch mending the ragged edges of her soul. She finally stopped in a place that felt like the edge of the world, Saltwick, a small fishing village clinging to the rugged Northumberland coast. It was a place of raw, untamed beauty, where the wind smelled of salt and coal smoke, and the cry of gulls was the only music. The North Sea, a churning expanse of gray and green, crashed against the rocky shore, a constant, powerful reminder of nature's indifference to human sorrow. It was perfect. Here, no one would look for a duchess. She found a small stone cottage for rent at the far end of the village, its back to the sea cliffs. It was damp, drafty, and smelled faintly of fish and wood smoke, but it was hers. She paid the landlord 3 months' rent in advance, giving her name only as Mrs. Vive. The name felt foreign on her tongue, the name of the new woman she was forced to become. Life in Saltwick was a harsh and relentless tutor. The soft, unblemished hands of a duchess quickly became chapped and calloused. She learned to haggle for fish at the quay, to mend worn nets for the fishermen, to take in laundry and scrub clothes until her knuckles were raw. She learned the rhythm of the tides and the burn of an honest day's labor. Exhaustion became her nightly lullaby, a welcome oblivion that kept the ghosts of her past at bay. The villagers were wary at first, their curiosity piqued by her refined accent and solitary habits, but her quiet diligence and her refusal to complain eventually earned her a grudging respect. They saw a woman working hard to make her way, and in a place like Saltwick, work was the only currency that mattered. Her pregnancy progressed, her belly swelling beneath her coarse wool dresses. Her only confidant was Mrs. Gable, the village midwife, a woman with hands as rough as tree bark and eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 tides. Mrs. Gable asked no questions about a missing husband or a wedding ring. She simply saw a mother in need of care. When her time came, it was a wild, storm-tossed night. The wind howled around the little cottage, and the waves crashed against the cliffs like cannon fire. With Mrs. Gable's steady hands and calming voice to guide her, Genevieve brought her son into the world. He was small and perfect, with a tuft of dark, curly hair and eyes that, when they opened, were the same startling blue as his father's, a painful, bittersweet inheritance. She named him Arthur. Holding him in her arms, feeling the warmth of his small body against hers, Genevieve felt a fierce, protective love that eclipsed all the pain and betrayal. He was hers. He was the reason for her struggle, the anchor in her storm-tossed life. She had found a new purpose, not as a duchess, but as a mother. In the harsh, windswept wilderness of Saltwick, surrounded by the raw power of the sea, Genevieve, now Vive, had not just survived, she had been reborn. Meanwhile, in London, Duke Alistair Beaumont's life had become a study in desolation. The annulment had been swift and silent, a clean cut. Genevieve was gone. The scandal had been contained. Percival was triumphant. Yet the victory Alistair had expected to feel was absent. In its place was a vast, echoing emptiness. The ducal mansion, once merely quiet, was now entombed in a profound silence. The scent of lilies was gone, replaced by the sterile smell of polish and dust. He would walk the halls at night, the sound of his own footsteps a lonely intrusion. He would stand at the door of Genevieve's sitting room, now stripped of her personal effects, and feel a pang of something he refused to name as regret. Percival was a constant presence, ever ready with a suggestion for a hunt, a trip to the continent, or a new, more suitable bride. He paraded a succession of eligible young ladies before Alistair, all of them beautiful, titled and utterly vapid. Alistair looked at them and felt nothing but a weary disgust. Their simpering smiles and calculated charm only served to highlight what he had lost. Genevieve, for all her quietness, had possessed a depth and an intelligence these women lacked. The initial rage that had fueled his decision began to cool, leaving behind the cold, hard sediment of doubt. Small inconsistencies from that night began to niggle at him. The artist, Mr. Davies, had confessed his part in the affair with an unseemly haste before disappearing completely, almost as if he had been paid to do so. Percival had seemed too prepared, his words of comfort too rehearsed. 1 year bled into 2, then 3. Alistair's detachment curdled into a bitter cynicism. He neglected his ducal duties, spent his nights with a bottle of brandy for company, and pushed away anyone who tried to get close. He was adrift in a sea of wealth and power, lonelier than he had ever been. The catalyst for change came from an unlikely source. A former footman, dismissed by Percival for a minor infraction, sought Alistair out, his tale fueled by cheap gin and a thirst for revenge. He spoke of seeing Lord Percival paying a large sum of money to a shabbily dressed man, an artist, he thought, in a dark alleyway on the very night the Duchess had been cast out. The footman's words were a spark thrown into the tinderbox of Alistair's long, simmering doubts. It ignited a cold, controlled fire within him. He had been a fool, a blind, arrogant fool, so easily manipulated by his own pride and his cousin's ambition. The possibility that Genevieve had been innocent, that he had destroyed her life based on a lie, was a thought so monstrous he could barely contain it. He did not confront Percival, not yet. He needed proof, irrefutable and absolute. He sought out Mr. Jones, a discreet and ruthlessly efficient private investigator, known for his ability to unearth secrets, the aristocracy buried deep. He gave Jones 2 tasks: find the artist, Mr. Davies, and uncover every detail of Percival Thorne's financial and personal life for the past 5 years. The investigation began to peel back the layers of Percival's deceit. Jones's reports arrived weekly, each one a fresh twist of the knife in Alistair's gut. Percival was drowning in gambling debts. He had mortgaged his own small estate to the hilt. He stood to inherit a significant portion of the Beaumont fortune if Alistair remained childless. The motive was as old and as ugly as Cain's. The final piece fell into place when Jones located the artist, Davies, living in squalor in a Parisian garret. Terrified at first, then emboldened by Jones's promise of protection and a reward that would dwarf Percival's bribe, Davies confessed everything. He provided a sworn affidavit detailing how Percival had approached him, preyed on his poverty, and coached him on how to stage the scene in the Duchess's sitting room. Alistair read the affidavit in his study, the same room where he had so often sat ignoring his wife. The words on the page were a death sentence for the man he had been. He saw with sickening clarity how Percival had played on his arrogance, his emotional distance from his own wife, his ducal pride that could not stomach the hint of betrayal. He had not been deceived by a master manipulator, so much as he had been a willing participant in his own blindness. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. He had wronged Genevieve in a way that felt unforgivable. Finding her, telling her the truth, was no longer a choice. It was a compulsion, the only possible first step on a long, dark road toward an atonement he was not sure he deserved. The investigator's final report was a thin, single-page document. It contained an address, a cottage in a village named Saltwick, Northumberland, and a name, Mrs. Vive. Jones had noted, with professional detachment, that the woman lived with a young son, approximately 2.5 years old. Alistair traveled north himself, the ducal carriage eating up the miles, each turn of the wheels a thrum of dread and desperate, fragile hope. He left the carriage at an inn in the nearest town and hired a simple trap for the final leg of the journey, not wanting to descend on the small village like a conquering lord. Saltwick was even more rugged and elemental than he had imagined. The air was sharp with the sting of salt, and the wind was a relentless, scouring force. He felt like an interloper, his fine wool coat and polished boots a stark contrast to the rough-spun clothes and weathered faces of the locals. He found her at the quay, a place teeming with the chaotic energy of the morning's catch. He saw her before she saw him, and the sight of her stole the breath from his lungs. It was Genevieve, yet it was not. The soft, pale duchess he remembered was gone. This woman was honed, shaped by the wind and the sea. Her skin was kissed by the sun, her hair whipped into a simple knot from which strands escaped to dance in the wind. Her dress was coarse, patched at the elbow, but she wore it with an unadorned dignity that shamed the memory of her silk gowns. She was haggling with a fisherman, her voice clear and strong, her hands gesturing with a confidence he had never seen in her. She was magnificent, and she was a complete stranger. He remained in the shadows of a stack of lobster pots, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He watched as she finished her transaction, placing a few silver fish into a basket. Then she turned and began the walk back toward the village, her stride purposeful. He followed at a distance, his mind reeling. This was the life he had condemned her to, this harsh, hand-to-mouth existence. And yet, she seemed not broken by it, but forged. She led him to the end of the village, to a tiny stone cottage that seemed to brace itself against the cliffs. And it was there, playing near the crooked doorway with a piece of driftwood, that he saw the boy. He was small for his age, dressed in patched trousers and a woolen jumper, but he stood with a sturdy defiance. His hair was a riot of dark curls, so like Alistair's own that it made his throat tighten. The boy looked up as Genevieve approached, a bright, happy smile transforming his little face, and Alistair saw his eyes. They were the Beaumont eyes, the same startling sapphire blue that had been passed down through generations, the same eyes that stared back at him from his own reflection every morning. The world tilted on its axis. The sound of the surf, the cry of the gulls, his own breathing, it all receded into a dull roar. The investigator's report had mentioned a child, but the reality of it was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left him gasping. This was his son, a boy who had spent his entire life in this harsh place, a boy who did not know his father's name, a boy whose father had cast his mother out, pregnant and alone. The magnitude of his failure, of his sin, crashed down upon him with the force of a tidal wave. For a long moment he could not move, could not breathe. He could only stare at the woman he had wronged, and the child he had never known, the living, breathing proof of his monstrous folly. He forced his legs to move, his boots crunching on the gravel path. Genevieve heard the sound and turned, her hand flying protectively to her son's shoulder. Her eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in a cold, shuddered fury that was more terrifying than any shouting. The warmth she had shown her child vanished, replaced by a glacial wall of ice. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a woman speaking to a dangerous stranger. "Genevieve," he breathed. The name a prayer and a curse. My name is Viev, she corrected him sharply. She pushed the small boy gently behind her skirts, shielding him from view. And you have no business here. Leave. I have every business, he said, his gaze fixed on the boy peeking out from behind her. He has my eyes. He has my eyes, she retorted, her voice trembling with repressed rage. He has nothing of yours. You forfeited that right. She addressed him with a formality that was a calculated slap in the face. Your Grace. The title, once a symbol of his power, now felt like an accusation. It was a lie, Genevieve. All of it. Percival orchestrated the entire thing. I have proof. The artist confessed. It was a conspiracy to ruin you, to ensure I had no heir. He reached into his coat, to the pocket where he kept the sworn affidavit, the proof of her innocence, but she held up a hand, stopping him. I don't care about your proof, she said, her voice low and venomous. I don't care about your cousin or his pathetic schemes. Do you think that changes anything? It doesn't matter if it was a lie. She took a step closer, her eyes blazing with a righteous fire he had never known she possessed. You believed it. You looked at me, your wife, the woman who had shared your bed and your name, and you believed the word of a drunken fool and a jealous snake over hers. You threw me away like I was nothing. You signed that paper and you cast me out without a second thought. Every word was a perfectly aimed blow, striking at the heart of his guilt. She was right. The lie was secondary. The true crime was his lack of faith, his cold, arrogant readiness to believe the worst of her. I was a fool, he whispered, the words inadequate, pathetic. I was blind. You were a coward, she spat. Now you will turn around, and you will leave my home. You will leave this village. You will not speak to my son. You are nothing to us. She turned her back on him, scooping Arthur into her arms and disappearing into the small cottage, the door closing behind her with a definitive click. Alistair was left standing alone on the path, the sea wind whipping at his face, the damning affidavit still clutched in his hand. He had come here seeking to give her the truth, hoping it might be a bridge back to her. He had not understood that the chasm between them was not built of lies, but of his own character, and it was a chasm he now feared was too wide to ever cross. He did not leave. To leave would be to accept the damnation she had handed him, to admit that he was the coward she believed him to be. He turned from her cottage and walked back toward the village, his steps heavy with a new, grim resolve. He would not run from this. He would face the consequences of his actions, no matter how harsh. The only lodging available in Saltwick was a single, grim room above the tavern, the Salty Dog. It was small, drafty, and smelled of stale ale and damp wool. The bed was lumpy. The single window looked out onto a muddy alley, and the chill from the sea seemed to seep through the very stone walls. It was a miserable hovel, and it was exactly what he deserved. He took the room, paying the suspicious innkeeper a month in advance. His presence in the village was an immediate source of gossip. The finely dressed stranger, living in the worst room in town, who did nothing but walk the coastline and stare out at the unforgiving sea. The villagers watched him with narrowed eyes, their loyalty firmly with the quiet, hard-working Mrs. Viev. His penance began not with grand gestures, but with a quiet, stubborn presence. He knew words were useless. He had to show her, through action, that he was no longer the man who had condemned her. A few days later he saw her struggling to split firewood, the axe unwieldy in her hands. The next morning, before the sun had risen, he went to the woodpile behind her cottage. He took off his fine coat, rolled up his sleeves, and set to work. The unfamiliar labor was brutal. The axe handle raised blisters on his soft hands, and his back screamed in protest. But he worked until a neat, generous stack of firewood stood by her back door. He left without a sound, his hands raw and bleeding. He knew she had seen it. He caught a glimpse of her face in the window, her expression unreadable. She used the wood, but she said nothing. He learned the rhythms of her life. He knew when she went to the quay for fish, when she took Arthur to play on the beach. He kept his distance, a silent, solitary figure on the edge of her world. He sent for his investigator, Mr. Jones, to come to Saltwick, not to intimidate her, but to be a witness. He approached her one afternoon as she was returning from the village. He did not block her path, but stood to the side, forcing her to choose whether to acknowledge him. "Genevieve," he said quietly, "I asked for 5 minutes of your time, not to ask for your forgiveness, but to give you the truth. You deserve to have it, whether you believe it or not." She hesitated, her jaw tight. Arthur clung to her skirts, staring at Alistair with wide, curious blue eyes. Finally, with a curt nod, she stopped. He did not make excuses. He did not beg. He simply laid out the facts, his voice calm and measured. He presented her with the affidavits from the artist and the footman, the bank records showing Percival's payments. Mr. Jones, standing a respectful distance away, was there to attest to their authenticity. "This is the proof of his conspiracy," Alistair concluded. "But it is also the proof of my failure. I should have trusted you. I should have known you. My blindness is what allowed his poison to work. There is no excuse for what I did." She took the papers, her expression guarded. She read them slowly, her eyes scanning each line. He watched as a flicker of something, vindication, perhaps, or a deeper sadness, crossed her face. "I am returning to London for 1 week," he told her. "I am going to destroy him. I will do it publicly. I will clear your name completely. When I am done, the annulment will be invalidated. You will be the Duchess of Beaumont again, in the eyes of the law and all of society." Her head snapped up, her eyes flashing. "I do not want to be your Duchess." "I know," he said softly. "This is not for me. It is for you, and for him." He glanced at Arthur. "He is the Beaumont heir. He deserves a name that is not shadowed by scandal. He deserves a mother whose honor is unquestioned." She said nothing, clutching the papers to her chest. He had given her the weapons to reclaim her own story. He bowed his head slightly and walked away, leaving her with the evidence and the choice. Alistair's return to London was surgical and swift. He convened a dinner for the most influential members of the peerage, including the heads of his and Genevieve's families. Percival was the guest of honor. In the middle of the dinner, in the suffocatingly polite atmosphere of high society, Alistair rose. He did not shout or accuse. He simply laid out the evidence, piece by damning piece. He read the artist's confession aloud. He produced the bank records. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Percival's sputtering denials. By the end of it, Percival was ruined. His own family cast him out, his creditors descended like wolves, and he fled the country within the week to escape prosecution. The annulment was declared fraudulent, and the story of the Duke's wronged wife and the villainous cousin became the scandal of the season. Genevieve's name was cleared, her honor restored with a brutal finality. Alistair felt no triumph, only a grim satisfaction. He had corrected the public record, but the private one, the one that mattered, was still broken. He turned his back on London and returned to the cold, drafty room in Saltwick to continue his penance. He returned to a village that viewed him differently. News traveled fast, even to this remote corner of the kingdom. They saw him now not as a suspicious outsider, but as a man trying to right a terrible wrong. It did not, however, change Genevieve's demeanor toward him. She remained distant, polite, and impenetrable. The breakthrough came, as it so often does, in a moment of crisis. A winter fever swept through the village, and Arthur fell ill. His small body was racked with coughing, his skin hot to the touch. Genevieve was frantic, her fierce maternal strength warring with her terror. Alistair found her in the dead of night, pacing the floor of her cottage, the door left ajar in her distress. He saw the panic in her eyes and the exhaustion etched on her face. He didn't ask for permission. He simply walked in, his presence a calm, solid anchor in her storm. "Let me help," he said, his voice gentle. She was too tired, too frightened to refuse. For 2 days and nights, they kept vigil together. They were not Duke and Duchess, not estranged husband and wife. They were simply two parents, united in their fear for their child. He fetched cool water from the well, held the boy's hand, and spoke to him in low, soothing tones. He watched Genevieve, saw the depths of her love and her resilience, and his admiration for her grew into a profound, humbling awe. In the quiet, desperate hours before dawn on the third day, as they sat in exhausted silence by Arthur's bedside, the fever finally broke. The boy's breathing eased, and he fell into a deep, healing sleep. Genevieve began to weep, silent tears of relief and exhaustion, tracking paths down her face. Alistair, without thinking, reached out and took her hand. It was the first time they had touched in over 3 years. She did not pull away. In that shared, vulnerable moment, in the flickering candlelight of the small cottage, a single hairline crack appeared in the wall between them. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. In the days after Arthur's recovery, a fragile truce settled between them. They began to talk, not about the past, but about the present. He asked her about her life in Saltwick, about the people, about the work she did. She spoke of the hardness of it, but also of the simple, honest pride she had found in her own strength. He saw that he could never ask her to return to the gilded cage of London. She had built her own life, a real life, here by the sea. One afternoon, as they walked along the beach while Arthur chased the waves, she stopped. "The annulment papers," she said, her voice quiet. "There was a second page. I never read it. I signed the first and pushed them away." Alistair frowned, trying to remember. The solicitor, Blackwood, had handled everything. He had been so consumed by rage, he had barely glanced at what he was signing. "A settlement, I presume. Provisions I was making." "Perhaps," she said, a strange look in her eye. "When you cleared my name, the documents were returned to your archives. I would like to see them." He sent a rider to London immediately. A week later, a heavy sealed packet arrived. That evening, in her cottage, by the light of a crackling fire, they unsealed it together. The first page was as they remembered, the cold legal language, his angry signature, her defiant one. Then he turned to the second page. It was not a settlement. It was a legal attestation, a clause his solicitor, a man more cautious and thorough than Alistair had given him credit for, had added as a matter of ducal protocol. It stated, in clear, unambiguous terms, that any child born to the Duchess within 10 months of the date of signing would be recognized as the legal and undisputed heir to the dukedom of Beaumont. It was a standard clause to protect the line of succession, a legal failsafe against future challenges. But that was not what made Alistair's breath catch in his throat. Below the formal text was a line, left blank for completion: name of child and date of birth. And there, in Genevieve's elegant, familiar script, was a single, defiant entry: Arthur Beaumont. The date was left blank, but the name was there. In that moment of utter desolation, as she was being cast out, she had performed one last act of maternal fury and desperate hope. She had claimed her son's name and his birthright on the very document that was meant to erase them both. She had known, even then, that she carried his heir, and he, in his blind rage, had signed it without reading it. His signature on the first page legally authenticated the second. He had unwittingly legitimized the son he did not know existed. The weight of her lonely strength, her foresight, her fierce protection of their child, struck him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain and a reverence that went beyond mere guilt. "You wrote his name," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He is a Beaumont," she said simply, her chin high. "I would not let you or your cousin take that from him. even if he never knew his own title. He knelt. There on the rough-hewn floor of her cottage, the powerful Duke of Beaumont knelt before the woman he had wronged. He did not ask for her hand. He did not ask for forgiveness. "I will not ask you to return to London," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "That life is a prison, and you are free. I will not ask you to be my Duchess. I ask only this. Let me be a father to our son. Let me prove, for the rest of my days, that I can be a man worthy of being your husband. Not here, or in London, but wherever you choose to build our home." He had finally ceded control. He had placed their future entirely in her hands. Genevieve looked down at him, at this powerful man brought to his knees, not by a rival, but by his own conscience. She saw not the arrogant duke who had banished her, but a humbled man who had fought to earn his way back, not to his position, but to his family. She saw the father of her child. "Get up, Alistair," she said softly, and in the use of his name, in the quiet command, was her answer. It was a choice, a deliberate act of earned trust. They did not leave Saltwick. It was the place that had saved her, the place where their son had been born, the place where Alistair had been reborn. He purchased the cottage and the land around it, and over the next year, they built a proper house, one filled with light and the sound of laughter, its windows looking out over the wild, beautiful sea. The ducal mansion in London was, as he had promised, transformed. Its grand ballrooms and silent corridors were given over to a charitable hospital for the city's poor, a testament to the fact that true nobility was found not in title, but in action. Their new life was built on an entirely new foundation. They were partners, equals. He learned the names of the fishermen. She advised him on his investments. He taught Arthur how to skip stones across the water, and she taught him the names of the coastal wildflowers. One crisp autumn evening, years later, they stood on the cliffs overlooking the sea. Arthur, now a sturdy, confident boy, ran ahead, his laughter carried back on the wind. Alistair reached for Genevieve's hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a simple, familiar gesture that spoke of 1,000 shared moments. The oppressive silence of their past had been replaced by the roar of the ocean and the easy comfort of a love that had been lost, fought for, and finally, truly found. The air was cold and clean, smelling of salt and damp earth, the scent not of an ending, but of home,